Okay, hi again. It's the Blue Games Master of Elthos. Alright, so my last video, my friend Chris sent me some questions. I am going to try to answer them. And so here we go. Uh, he says, first off, I get the impression that this system overcomplicates the concept of law, chaos, good, and evil. So it's an observation, interesting. I don't. I personally don't feel that it does, but it what it does is it layers on top of that concept additional layers, but that the foundation still remains the same. So this card still remains the same. It's still you still have the law, chaos, good and evil dichotomy, and that doesn't actually change very much in terms of how it's dealt with. So I don't know. I think what it does is it adds complexity to how you can interpret it and how many levels of reflection of that basic foundation you can permeate upward. But the foundation I think still stays exactly the same and hasn't really changed. Okay, so what is gained by following this system? He says, I know that you've used symbolism in our games, but who notices? I only know because you told me. Um, did this inclusion affect the enjoyment of the players? So this is mostly a behind the scenes games master mechanic, and it's really primarily for me as the games master. And the way that I use it is I use it to shape and guide the story, the backstory. So, and the way that I play it, I have a sandbox world, but I have this underlying backstory that exists and goes on whether the players are there or not. And that backstory is largely guided by these principles. And I even go so far as to help shape the backstory by occasionally or periodically going to astronomy tables and looking at what planets are in what constellations at a given time. And I should stop right here for a second and mention that there is a previous video where I'm actually responding to, and I'm going to put a link to that video in the description. So just so you know, there's a prior video. You should probably check that out if you come here first. Anyway, so yeah, so but mostly the mechanic is basically for me at this level. It's helping me to guide the story. And so, does that affect the enjoyment of the players? Yes, it absolutely definitely does, because while they don't know how that's working, so they're not directly involved with my symbolic overlapping and permutations and relationships, it's definitely affecting the backstory. And because I have this system that kind of stabilizes that sort of metaphysical level, it helps me to shape the narrative. And so, like in my original video, I gave this example of the black dog coming from the west, and that as an act of symbolic implication in the game. Now, the players don't know most of the time when that's happening, but I know, and I use that throughout the story to align elements within the context of the plot and the narrative. So yeah, I think it definitely does have an influence on the enjoyment of the game, because the backstory has a coherency that otherwise I was never able to achieve before, and I am able to achieve it now. And especially on my longer term campaigns, it has a arching influence, and so I think it does affect the players quite a bit. And in this particular game, it did actually manifest itself directly in a number of instances, although it didn't state it as such. But there was one point where Chris's character Hermel met a old blind man, and the old blind man gave him a chance to read from a tarot deck, and he picked a card, and it turned out to be the dragon card. And that has a long-term effect on what happened in the story. And there's also a background relationship that got created between Hermel and a certain set of Elkron when that happened. And so I know that, he doesn't know that. It's definitely affected the story. He doesn't know how, but it's still to the benefit of the game. And I think that, yeah, he has enjoyed the game more because I'm doing that in the background. Okay, so you talk about looking back at a story and how you were able to read the story symbolically. Who else can? Who is it for? Okay. Eventually, I think that I might publish things about this, that where I take one of my games and I publish a story that shows the story relationships, and that becomes its own story. And that would become a story about the Elkron and how this group of adventurers affected the world, on a metaphysical level. But during the game, I'm not doing that. I'm not talking about it. It's just happening in the background. So right now, for my games, it's for me. It benefits the players in the sense that I just mentioned, but it's really for me. I'm the only person looking at that at this point. Okay, and Chris goes on to say, I think there is a lot to be gained by making alignments more meaningful. I also think that a heavily symbolic game where players are fully aware of its importance and able to read it could be fun if everyone is on the board. It might make for a great world concept where the players have access to a table of symbols and play the game with this knowledge. At some point I may start bringing that in. There is a table of these correspondences. I've never actually shown it to any of my players, but it exists. And the only players that I'm likely to show it to are high-level mages and above. And I have 2 classes in my world that cover the combination of clerics and magic users, and those are mages and sages. And so they would potentially have access to that table. And yeah, I think that would be very interesting. I'm actually looking forward to the day when that actually happens in my world, so that I can deploy that table in a meaningful way to my players. And then lastly, he goes on to say, I currently find the numerical tracking of alignments interesting. I think that some people might also appreciate it. And what he's talking about is the way that I run my alignment system is that during the game, you will have a action by a player character, and I will ask the player character, what was the motive of the action? And when I get that information, I have a way in the Mythos machine during recording of experience gains where I will say, okay, this action is of this kind. It's a civic action, it's a military action, it's a religious action. And then underneath that, I'll have the type of action. So it was, if it was let's say it was an illegal action. So it was a misdemeanor, it was a felony, something like that. So I pick that. And what that does is that moves the scale for the character along the law chaos axis. And then on the other side, I have the motive, and I ask them what was the motive. And is the motive virtuous? Is it sinful? Is it a vice? Or is it a grace? And depending on how they answer, I'll pick. And then in each of those categories, I have a bunch of sub things. So it could be, if it's a virtue, is it the virtue of honor? Is it the virtue of friendliness? Is it the virtue of integrity? And so on. If it's a vice, is it the vice of greediness? Is it the vice of gluttony? And so on. And that moves the scale on the good-evil axis. And so between those two, I get a rating for that particular deed. And that moves the character's alignment. So instead of starting with alignment and saying, okay, you're lawful good, so you're only allowed to do these actions, I take it the other way. I say, what is the intent of your character's alignment? Okay, he starts out as a paladin and he's lawful good. But now, from now forward, his alignment is going to depend on his actions and his motives. And if his actions and motives don't correspond with lawful good, his character's alignment will subsequently change over time through the course of the game. And if he winds up becoming chaotic evil, well, that will have an impact on that Elkron that he's following, the Elkron's opinion of him, and things will happen. So it's a different orientation than the use of alignment, and I think it's a more substantial one in the sense that, one, it's mathematically based, and two, it reverses the role of alignment in the game. It's not mandating that players play according to a certain alignment. It's recording what they do and then responding with, well, this is the alignment that your character achieves. And as that alignment changes throughout the game, if you do lawful good actions all the time, hey, I saved the princess, hey, I gave alms to the beggar, hey, I did this, oh, I avoided doing the negative thiefy thing that I could have done but I didn't, then the character's lawful good status will increase over time, and they will achieve a higher and higher level, at which point they'll start getting powers. Because once you go to the extremes, the different Elkron who are in the different alignment categories will start taking notice. So if you get 10 points out, they might raise an eyebrow and say, okay, he's getting pretty high over there in the lawful good, so now the lawful good Elkron are going to start noticing. And on the other side, the lawful evil and other Elkron, the chaotic evil Elkron, may also take notice and say, hey, this guy's getting a little too something over there, and maybe we should start sending some things over his way and try to mess up his alignment. In which case, those kind of things will happen at the spiritual level, because they might do things like try and tempt the character into doing things for the wrong reasons, and so on. So it adds another dimension to the game. I think it's fascinating. I enjoy using it, and I use it throughout the game. So, but again, this is another thing that I do mostly in the background. So I don't explain these things to the players and say, okay, this is exactly what's happening. I leave it as a vague mystery, which is why Chris is saying, hey, well, we never see any of this stuff in your game. Well, it's there. I'm just not talking about it. And yes, it's definitely having an influence on the game, and I think it's a positive one. So there you go. That's the answer. This is the blue one. Games Master of Elthos signing out. See you next time, perhaps in red. Who knows?